Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most important and honestly most misunderstood periods in American history through the eyes of W.E.B. Du Bois and his masterpiece, Black Reconstruction in America. We're going to look at what really happened in Mississippi and Louisiana right after the Civil War, when a bold experiment in multiracial democracy was tried and, as Du Bois argues, ultimately betrayed. So let's start right with Du Bois's main idea. He looked at the end of Reconstruction and said, hold on, this wasn't some simple failure. He saw it as a deliberate, violent takedown. He argued that you had this new movement of black and white workers trying to build a better life, and they were crushed, systematically crushed by the old plantation owners and new money from the North, who used everything from economic threats to just plain brutal force. So this is the big question Du Bois puts right in front of us. To really dig into it, we're going to follow his lead and look at two states that were at the very center of the storm, both of which had black majority populations at the time, Mississippi and Louisiana. First up, Mississippi. Du Bois paints this picture of a state where the wealthy planter class wasn't just, hesitant about change. No, they were openly hostile to the entire idea of a world where black people were free, let alone equal citizens with a voice in government. I mean, right after the Civil War, the first thing the white elite in Mississippi did was try to turn back the clock. They passed these laws known as the Black Codes, which were basically a playbook to recreate slavery in everything but the name, stripping away basic rights and locking freed people into a system of total economic control. And if you want to know how they felt about it, just listen to this. This is a quote from a major newspaper. Shall Mississippi ratify the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery? We answer no, 10,000 times no. I mean, that's not subtle, right? That is screaming your defiance from the rooftops. Well, faced with that level of resistance, the federal government had to step in. They sent the military to enforce new voter registration. And look at what happened. The numbers just completely flipped. For the very first time in the history of Mississippi, black voters were actually the majority. The entire political world was turned upside down. And this, right here, is such a critical point that Du Bois makes. The old guard was screaming about Negro domination. But what was the reality? When they held a convention to write a new state constitution, even with a black voter majority, only 17 out of the 100 delegates elected were black. This was about sharing power, not some kind of takeover. So what did this new mixed-race convention even talk about? Well, their critics at the time basically said they were wasting time talking about helping poor people. But for Du Bois, that wasn't beside the point. That was the point. The main goal was to tackle the incredible poverty facing working people, both black and white. And what did they actually get done? Well, far from being the disaster its opponents claimed, this government created one of the most progressive and democratic frameworks Mississippi had ever seen. They got rid of property requirements for voting, they set up the state's first public school system for all kids, and they wrote a new constitution that was so solid it lasted for over 20 years. Okay, so that's Mississippi. Now let's turn to Louisiana. Du Bois shows us this is a much more complicated, much more volatile situation, with a really unique history and a legacy of just brutal political violence. You see, unlike Mississippi, Louisiana, and especially New Orleans, had this large, well-organized, and often wealthy community of free people of color that existed long before the Civil War. They were educated, they were politically active, and they had institutions like the New Orleans Tribune newspaper to immediately start demanding full citizenship and economic power for everyone. And you're probably sensing a pattern here. Just like in Mississippi, the old planter class was determined to shut this down. They grabbed power back in 1865, passed their own vicious black codes, and basically created a political powder keg that was just waiting for a spark. And this timeline shows you just how quickly that spark was lit. The mayor of New Orleans, an ex-Confederate, essentially deputized a white supremacist mob. He then unleashed them, along with the city police, on the convention hall. It was a full-on attack, with them firing into the building on unarmed delegates and their supporters. I don't just take my word for it. The U.S. Army commander on the scene, General Philip Sheridan, put it about as bluntly as you can. He said this wasn't a riot, it was a massacre, a planned political extermination. The human cost was just horrific. Nearly 200 people were killed or wounded. And that event sent a cold, clear message across the entire South. If you try to build a more equal democracy, you will be met with overwhelming, deadly force. Now, to understand the messy politics that came next, you have to know this word, scalawag. It was an insult, right, used for white Southerners who joined the Republican Party. And as Du Bois shows, these figures became central to the state's chaotic and, yes, often corrupt government. But this is where Du Bois really flips the simple story of corruption on its head. He uses the Republican governor's own words to show who was pulling the strings. It wasn't just a few politicians. It was the state's white economic elite, the best people, the bankers and businessmen who were flooding the legislature with bribe money to get what they wanted. So, what's the big takeaway from these two tragic stories? How did these experiments in democracy actually end? Well, Du Bois is crystal clear on this. These governments were not just voted out of office. They were overthrown in what he calls a violent counter-revolution. It was basically a war, waged by groups like the KKK, using a whole toolkit of organized terror, economic blackmail, and just massive election fraud to destroy democracy and put white supremacy back on top. And this quote from John R. Lynch, a black congressman from Mississippi, just perfectly captures the tragedy of it all. You can hear him and other black leaders constantly appealing to the rule of law, to the democratic process, to the ballot box, even as that entire system was being burned down right in front of them. So this brings us back to where we started, to Du Bois's central argument about what was really at stake here and what was truly lost when Reconstruction was finally destroyed. And this is the absolute core of his argument. For Du Bois, the overthrow of Reconstruction was never just about race. It was about class. The violence and the fraud were tools to smash a growing alliance between black workers and poor white workers, to make sure that real power, both political and economic, stayed exactly where it had always been, in the hands of a small, wealthy, white elite. And that leaves us with a final, really powerful question that Du Bois's work just forces us to think about. It's a question that's not just about the past, but one that echoes right into our present. What happens when a democratic movement is crushed, not because it's failing, but because it's succeeding, because it's becoming, maybe, a little too democratic for the people in power?